how do you organize Figma as your startup's design team grows?
The source of truth is the product because that is what the customers use. And if you find visual discrepancies in the product or things that don't work, that needs fixing. The Figma file doesn't actually take that high of a priority. If your Figma file is super clean, but your product isn't, you've got way bigger fish to fry. The biggest unlock is to start thinking about your files as something you ship along the design process.
So here's the deal today. We've picked out some real questions from across X and Reddit for product designers around how to use Figma more effectively. We've got Martin here from the team to share how we do these things at Jam. And so without further ado, we're going to start with the first question, which is, how do you organize Figma as your startup's design team grows? And now I'm going to show the real question here. Hey everyone, I have a question about file organization when working with a team of designers. I'm curious if you have different files for each figure you work on, or if you have one master file with all the screens in your application, or both. If anyone knows a good process for organizing, I would really appreciate the help. And then before we answer that one, let me show the second question here, which is, I've recently inherited a very large unorganized Figma project with flows and comps all over the place. This project is fast-paced with several reviewers, product owners, dev, etc. What do you normally do in order to make it obvious which layouts and flows are under review, work in progress, or ready for dev? I typically have 3 separate Figma projects for each of those stages, but with this being so big and fast-paced, that approach is going to be cumbersome and probably open the door for more errors. Any best practices or favorite ways of working you have?
I guess the answer is it depends. Like there's so many layers of that question. Um, Maybe the first one is, how do you organize your Figma files as a startup? I think the answer is it depends. It depends on the size of the startup in general, but also the size of your design team. I think very overarchingly, like at the beginning, you might really get away with like having your entire product in one Figma file. And then as the surface area grows, or like as you're designing more and more, and let's say you're a team of one designer, you can kind of get away with having everything in one file. At some point, it's too big to have in one file and it becomes really unorganized, and you start getting into this like, where's the latest version of what type of like shenanigans. You don't even need to be 2 people on the team yet in terms of designers. You just need to like have designed so much that like it just becomes really hard to organize. And so you have a million pages in one file and like different product areas or however you want to sort it. And so I think the first thing that I always do when I come into teams, or the biggest unlock, is to start thinking about your files as something you ship along the design process. And so you can use, every team has a different process. I just like use the classic sort of double diamond, which is like the classic industrial design process, right? But you have something that's in discovery. You then are like, here you're doing understand work. You're really trying to like use design as a tool to understand scope and maybe even the strategy or the different approaches. And here you're then like nailed on a solution and just kind of refining and crafting the last details. And then at some point you want to signal to engineering because the show goes on, right? Like, hey, this is actually ready for you to be picked up.
To
Yeah.
stop you on the double diamond, just you refer to that, but I don't really know what it means. Like it means you start by exploring potential options, then you narrow to suggest
Right.
solutions, then you have reviews, so then you explore more options, and then you refine again. Is that
Yeah.
kind of the idea?
The thinking behind the double diamond is sort of like divergence, as you said, into 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 both directions, and then convergence, and then again divergence and convergence. Think of like, you can run any process here. Like, some people call this like, this is the understand work. There's sometimes a hill model, like you work your way up the hill to understand all the uncertainty, and then you sort of like just execute down the hill. But first, you got to understand how high the hill is to climb. The point is not like getting fixed on the double diamond. The point is like, you want your files to move along that process, whatever process that is that you're running as a design team, and not dump everything into one file and then have certain pages be like, this is ready, but this is not ready. And then like everyone in the entire company is confused at like where the latest version of things are. So that's how I think about it. I'm just using this as an example, since probably the most common framework that most designers know of. Also, what is, I think, still taught in school. And then here's another just hint. Like, again, like when you're in a file, like just think about like where do you need most level of collaboration? And you probably want those pages at the top. You can organize them again, like process wise, like you're going to start out with just like, figuring out like writing words into the Figma file, or maybe you're just doing some mood boarding. Then you're discovering, right? You're looking at potential approaches. Then you're creating a page where it's like, okay, I've went through a certain review phase with the rest of the team where I'm like, okay, we're locked on the solution. Let's like put it in design. And at some point you want to put it engineering ready and you want to have that sort of as the top page because there's a high level of collaboration. And so when people pop into the file, just think about that experience, right? Like don't hide the stuff that's actually most frequent at the very bottom of the file, because otherwise people won't find it. You can organize these pages in any way you like. The point is just like put the stuff people need to see, or maybe the latest version at the top.
Hmm. And wait, so and this first thing you took us through, this was sort of on the whole
File
file
thumbnail.
level,
Here
like
you're
that.
just yeah, here you're doing the work in the Figma file and the pages. So like what this looks like is here, right? These are your pages. And then all you're really doing with the thumbnail is to sort of in the file browser Figma, like to indicate like where is it in the process, right? And where like where's stuff that's like where's it in the pipeline, or the process of the design process in a way, right? Signals to engineers, like this is for me, signals to PMs, like, hey, this is probably where I should be spending most of my time. Um, yeah. So you're just exposing what sort of the where you're at, right? Um, to the top. It's good
And
that
and
you
what about
mentioned that, right?
and what
And
about the
so
question of does every feature need like you touched on it briefly, like sort of, oh, I wouldn't go at the start and like build out a whole bunch of different Figma files when you only just need one at the start. But what is the indicator that you're like, oh, I need a, like I should create a new file for this,
I think backing up, I think at the very beginning when you're really building 0 to 1, you almost want to have like everything in one file, like the entire product and the entire surface area. And that's super helpful because you kind of understand everything. Everyone knows what like will eventually end up in code. But it can also be kind of a deterrent or like a distraction for the designers to start like creating a second source of truth of the product in Figma. And then because the Figma files can't be used by customers. And so you also need to think very consciously as a design team about like constantly maintaining the source of truth when actually you want the the Figma file is just a visual spec to tell engineers like what to build or what the experience should look like. What your customers use is the product. And you also want your design team not obsessed with like keeping everything like up to date and in sync with like creating a source of truth in Figma. It's like, no, no, no. The source of truth is the product because that is what the customers use. And if you find like visual discrepancies in the product or things that don't work, that needs fixing. The Figma file doesn't actually take that high of a priority. So there is this point where um, you also want to think about this sort of as a design function where it like can actually backfire on you um in terms of like the amount of management that you have to put in and effort you have to invest to keep everything up to date. But the other thing is like it's just a distraction from what really matters and drives the business, which is like no one can use your Figma file. And like if your Figma file is super clean but your product isn't, like you've got way bigger fish to fry. In terms of like really tactical, like when do you know it's time to break like stuff out? There's the actual limit of the file itself will go like, hey, this file is becoming too large. And the designer will notice on the way to that warning, like Figma is going to start to get slower and slower just because they're kind of 2 GB limit of on the files themselves. So like that's at that point you need to split it out because it becomes kind of unusable, especially when like multiple engineers are in the file and you're still trying to design something on page 17, but they're on page 1. Um, so that's that. The other thing is like when you're spending more time like browsing the file, than actually designing, I think is also like a really good indicator. When that flips from like, okay, 20% browsing, 80% designing to like, okay, like now I'm doing like 50-50, like where is my stuff versus actual designing is also a good point to break out. If you really think about a product,
Which would be crazy if you spent 20% of your time trying to
yeah,
find the right file.
in large organization, that kind of happens. You'd be surprised. Like at a startup, no. I think the other thing is like as soon as you have working code and the product is there, like let's say you're really 0 to 1, like you don't even have anything in code yet. Um, then as soon as sort of like the first release is out or like you've got your MVP out, like then it's time to probably start treating it a little bit more as this is a visual artifact that helps ship code, and code is what is used by customers. And so then it probably makes sense to split it out. What you can do, however, is just keep like sort of a sort of key screen library. So like have a separate Figma file where just keep kind of like key screens of product areas that you can just pull out at any point in time if you're like then starting a new project or whatever. But so that's kind of the how I think about it in the first unlock. And then like how we break it down is we think about the Figma file workflow in like use cases. So like I'm working on a new feature or a new initiative. There's like I'm working on an existing feature or an existing initiative, like I'm like working on a settings redesign or like what may have you. You've got some existing feature in the product. Customers have complained they want to make like they want this, and that, or we want to make it better. We want to evolve this feature or initiative. Like we need to work off of something existing. And then there's also like just this use case of like I've got this idea. I want to imagine something new. Um, and so if you think about those use cases that you have, like fundamentally as a designer, you can design workflows and processes around that. And so what we do, this is a Figma file. Um, and so we just have a template Figma file with the pages already laid out. We then duplicate that file. Again, we're really creating something from scratch here. And then we just put it into discovery and we're working on this discovery page, and then maybe we indicate on the canvas like what the status is, like what we're doing. But this is really at this point not that important. I think what's most important, at least for the designer developer relationship, is that you're using the section ready for development tags that Figma gives you natively, and then you push it along the process. You might switch pages, um, and you kind of make something like engineering ready, right? And signal that. And then you're always going to have to do small changes during your sprint or cycle or whatever you call it. And then um, larger changes like then give you the opportunity to actually just duplicate the file. So let's say like someone is like, well, the whole thing doesn't work or whatever, or we drop into the second use case, so that second swim lane of like I actually need to work on an existing feature. That gives you the opportunity to like duplicate that file that was engineering ready a couple of weeks ago or months ago, like setting the V0. And now you're going to duplicate that file and just flip the thumbnail and start working off of that thing again. You could theoretically say like you put it back into discovery, but then you kind of have to like reimagine the entire. Sometimes it happens. You have to reimagine the entire. Ideally, this doesn't happen, right? Reimagine the entire approach, but um, you can kind of pick it up and then put it into the I'm working on an existing thing, and then you kind of ship the second version of that, right? So version 1 versus version 2. And if you're just exploring stuff, like I think either you're doing it in your drafts or what is actually really nice is just to have one common big playground file so other designers can see what other designers are just exploring. And so like ideas kind of, cross pollinate and it's like, ooh, this is interesting. Let me also spend 5 minutes like riffing on this thing. Um, Works in smaller teams probably like a little bit more, you know, difficult in larger teams because again that file would blow up, but you could do this on any level, probably not across the entire team. Maybe it's just you have multiple designers in your team, just create a playground file and have people like just give yourself also the room and the space to explore stuff, but also give give yourself the freedom to also be messy, like have one messy sort of like file where like everything just like it doesn't matter, right? It's all about just the ideas.
Oh, I love that. We should show at some point. Well, I guess the whole point is maybe not to show the playground, but that'd be fun to
Show
show
the
the
messy
playground,
playground.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I think. Okay, so now for the second question here. The second theme we have is how does everyone handle design reviews with developers? Now I'm going to go into the real question here. My challenge is that I spend a lot of time, around 2 hours, identifying the differences between the developed version and the design. I don't understand why there are so many spacing and color issues. Now I have to mark the spacing measurements and color code very clearly so they don't miss them. Note we have a proper design system for design and dev, but more for basic stuff like typography, fields, colors, buttons, etc. I'm curious, how does everyone else handle design reviews with developers? How do I make this process more efficient? Thank you. All right, Martin, what do you say on this one?
Like the number one thing is like just like expose your thinking, right? And so a lot of times it's just creating documentation on Canvas that they don't miss if you don't want them to miss it. Because the guy was like, well, we have a design system. They know how to use Figma. Why are they still missing it? It's like, well, have you really exposed the thinking? You can also use dev mode to like really get the, annotations and some of the um, measurements right. And so it's like visually, my tip is also make it visual. Like, yes, it's here, but like, don't expect them to like check everything here. Like most engineers don't even check this thing unless they're super into Figma itself. Um,
And
so
what were
one
you
is like
showing?
explaining
What were you showing on the left too? I wasn't seeing how that was related.
this thing.
Or no, just the frame that's to the left of the one you're showing. Like you see
Oh,
the
okay.
space here.
Like this is just sort of how I'm thinking about so this is an example of the settings layout. And we have a container that has a max width of 640. Then generally there's a section. Sections can have groups. And then within a group, there's a setting. And then a setting is divided into the settings header and the settings content. And then there's a separator. There can be another setting. Like that's what makes it groups. And sections can have multiple groups. And at the end of the day, what you see here is like exactly that. You have a section, two sections, right? You have a
Oh, and you're
group.
just giving the hierarchy in a separate way for you to be
Yeah,
able to
I'm thinking about
understand it
like
more
how I am
clearly.
thinking about the components I'm exposing to engineers as well, right? And then I'm not saying this is the right way to architect it, but what I'm saying is you're exposing the thinking, and so now you need to have a conversation about it. And so
Mm-hmm.
that thinking should and can should be discussed in a meeting, probably in person or whatever, or a jam. Uh, but it's just like a self ad, insert self ad. Um,
Yeah.
but the point is like those higher level things, you have to either communicate visually async like I'm doing here, or you pair it with an in-person meeting, but don't expect your engineers to read this out of here, like how the page should be structured. Like, because this is like really nitty gritty detail of like what the padding is. We're using space 3 color token and they can put in the right token, but they should understand the overall layout, right? And you need to produce some artifact to help them understand that. So that's like how do you get them better aligned? The other thing is like just annotate stuff that you think is like you'll form an opinion as a designer as you're working with an engineer, like what they tend to miss and what annoys you, and then like use that intuition to then just annotate stuff beforehand, right? Like this thing doesn't show up if they're using not using dev mode, and some of our engineers actually have like normal Figma seats, so they never see this, or they need to basically go like, oh crap, I need to switch into dev mode, right? Um, and so that annotation helps them just like a reminder, I need to switch into dev mode. It's very specific for us. It's because some of our engineers just have design seats and they also want to use like Figma design. And so I need to remind them. The point is not to do this for your engineers. The point is like have the intuition and as you're working with people, like understand what they miss and then understand what you get annoyed by and that you don't repeat the same mistake twice. You just have to expose that work beforehand, right? So that could be visual, that could be annotations, like don't miss this. Oftentimes you're better putting this on canvas and having it visual than putting into a linear ticket or a Jira ticket because it gets lost. It's also sometimes read without context. And I feel like, just putting it on the screen is probably the best option for most engineers.
It feels like your point around it too is that most of this work happens before it's actually getting implemented versus afterwards, right? And like at the point,
Right.
if you're asking yourself, oh, there's so many discrepancies between the first build and Figma, then it's not too late, but that's an indicator that there wasn't enough prep work actually to set things
Right.
up at the start.
And so the question was initially around, well, but we have a design system. And it's like, well, the first question is like, is it aligned? The episode before we talked about like creating this common language between design and engineering. And so my first question is like, okay, you have a design system, but is it aligned? Oh yeah, it's super aligned. Okay, but then like it's sort of like, is it then a um where the engineers don't know how to use Figma yet, which also sort of answered, right? The person clearly stated that they wanted, like they onboarded their engineers. So then it's just like a communication issue for me, right? And this is sort of the third layer that we're looking into. You have an aligned design system, okay, check. Um, so you're using the same token, like a spacing 2 is a spacing 2 also in engineering. And so it's like 16 pixels in Figma, it's 16 pixels um, in code, right? And actually what happens to the app. Then the second layer is like, do they know how to read those spacing tokens out of Figma? Do they know how to use dev mode? Do they know how to use the tool? If they do, then the third level is just like setting up your meetings and your communication in a way where like you have some material to actually talk about the thinking that you put in. Like the question the designer should probably ask themselves is like, have you given enough context? Or what context have you not given is the question, right? What could have you done better in terms of like just creating a more context and overall exposing your thinking as the designer, as you've deeply thought about things? And how have you exposed that to engineers? And if your answer is, well, I think dev mode gives them all the answers, well, probably not, right? And so investigate that link of communication that you have towards your engineers. I think there's a lot of things designers think about that are like, oh, this is so obvious to me. Yeah, but it's like as you switch roles into a different discipline, it's just not. Like there's a different focal point in terms of like an engineer's trying to cover all the edge cases, make sure nothing blows up, right? And a designer is always about like the happy path, or they've intrinsically thought about the layout or grouping of elements and hierarchy. So it's just also understanding that like what's obvious to you might not be obvious to someone else. And collaborating is about sort of like coming to an alignment um, of where that person stands, where you are, and identifying those gaps, and then making like exposing those gaps, and hopefully plugging the holes in them through meetings, through information, through just like aligning.
And it takes effort. I mean, it's just clear to me that like
Yeah, it's
you
effort.
putting out that
Yeah,
framework, like it's just that's another step. That's another thing to do.
yeah,
But it's like, but then you see like that. I feel like that hierarchy makes it a lot more clear in that example there. And so that
great.
was like a necessary context to set. But it's like, oh, do I need to do
And
this, right?
yeah, so like this, I mean, this is a very concrete example of how I want the settings layout to work, but it's for every settings page that we have. And we have more than one settings page in more than one workspace and a ton of different conditions. The settings also vary depending on what plan you have. So it gets pretty complex, but you need to like expose the system thinking that like, hey, I've thought about this once and it works for everything. Like it works for every sort of settings page. And I've tested it, right? So like we have a ton of settings pages in different plans, and there's nothing really fun about settings pages, but you can see that this also works with our integrations page, right? There's sections, and then there's settings, and then there's the settings content, which in this case is integrations, right? Again, it's just like the system level thinking that I have exposed, which is then probably a lot easier for engineers to implement if they know of that, right? Otherwise, if they're looking at it screen by screen, like that is such a gigantuan task for them to figure out the system that the designer had in their mind. Like, you know what I mean? Like to do that pattern recognition, that's what you're here for as the designer,
Mm-hmm.
eventually, like hopefully, is to do that work. but then you need to also communicate that work.
If you like this episode, make sure to check out our prior episodes with Martin where we go into topics like our design system and also our onboarding flow when we were redoing it. If you don't already, make sure you subscribe to Building Jam to see our episodes when they come out, and it also helps our channel reach more people just like yourselves building things. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.